Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to the second day of our History and Class Consciousness online marathon, 1001 Nights of the Totality. Let me introduce myself. I'm Kostas Gousis, and I'm a lawyer and a political scientist, and currently postdoctoral researcher at Padion University. So today it's the second day. Yesterday we had two first fantastic sessions, and we will continue today by presenting each chapter one by one. We have three presentations, and we will begin with Victor Strazzeri, who is presenting the phenomenon of reification. Victor Strazzeri is a postdoctoral researcher in social sciences at the Federal University of Sao Paulo and associated researcher at the Historical Institute of the University of Bern. After his undergraduate studies in Brazil, he earned his PhD in political science from the Free University of Berlin. His thesis on the young Max Weber and German social democracy was published by Brill and will be out soon in paperback from Haymarket Books. He currently coordinates the project Internationalization of the Historical Critical Dictionary of Marxism, and his latest research and publications examine the links between communist movement, women's activism, and the feminist movement in the 1970s. So, Victor, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kostas. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here for the second day of our marathon. If I had to give a title to my presentation on the first part of the reification essay, it would be Georg Lukács as a Marxist. That's because the reification chapter is the most substantial result of Lukács's apprenticeship years in Marxism. By that, I mean the period from when he first joined the Hungarian Communist Party, so December 1918, to when he finished History and Class Consciousness 4 years later in Christmas 1922. The reification chapter was written for HCC alongside the book's final essay on organization, but reification is the last thing that Lukács wrote. It's the only essay without a date in the end, so we assume it was finished with the book itself. It is hence as far as Lukács got after 4 years of studying Marx and the Marxists. Considering we're still reading this work 100 years later, that's not bad. Now, Lukács had at least a decade of intellectual activity before his pathway as a Marxist even began in 1918, which helps explain his accomplishments after 4 short years of identifying as one. I emphasize this aspect so we grasp HCC as a culmination and at the same time as a way station in Lukács's development process as a revolutionary intellectual. That process had a decisive impulse when he joined the communists in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and would extend at least until the end of the 1920s in terms of his initial confrontation with the Marxist tradition. That intellectual relationship would continue, as we know, for many decades until his death in 1971. But studying Marxism is not the only thing Lukács was doing in those 4 apprenticeship years, leading to the milestone that was HCC. He was heavily involved in political work, and within a few months of becoming a Marxist, had risen to a leading figure in the Hungarian Council Republic, the short-lived Hungarian Socialist Revolution, which lasted between March 21st and August 1st, 1919. So for all the twists and turns in Lukács's pre-Marxist phase, and for all the periods we can parcel out his subsequent trajectory as a Marxist, I believe the most significant rupture in his life is the one in late 1918, early 1919, when he became one. Because his adherence to Marxism did not only represent an intellectual break, it coincided with his passage from critical observer to revolutionary activist, from a member of intellectual circles to a participant in a mass movement, from an academic thinker to a party one. In short, it was the most significant turn of fate in his life, a term Lukács used in an essay from 1944. That's because it represented a radical transformation from the standpoint of theory and of praxis. The contemplation of those 2 dimensions, by the way, will also provide the key for my brief presentation on part 1 of the reification essay. Now, I titled my presentation Lukács as a Marxist because 2 paradoxes accompany the reception of HCC. While Lukács opens the book with a claim to orthodox Marxism, calling for a return to Marx's method, he's curiously most often associated with conceptual innovations in Marxism, most notably his critique of reification. So Lukács is the orthodox innovator as the first paradox. On the other hand, HCC is often associated with Lukács's pre-Marxist recoveries, especially his Hegelian perspective and non-Marxist influences, notably his neo-Kantianism. Just what these labels refer to is something I will approach later. I'm referencing them here because the second paradox is that of Lukács as the orthodox Marxist who innovates by leaning on non-Marxist sources. Now, the first of these paradoxes is only apparent. A call for going back to the roots of a theory or genre is not necessarily in contradiction with opening its horizons. In Lukács's specific case, orthodoxy is opposed to dogmatism, to considering Marx and Engels' writings as holy script, to be followed to the letter without question. On the other hand, it's also opposed to revisionism, that is, the idea of updating Marx's method because a supposedly radically new reality confronts the socialist movement. We've all heard this before, of course. So what are Lukács's orthodox innovations in history and class consciousness? And my presentation really wants to put a lot of these things, very complex things in a nutshell, so bear with me. I don't know if I managed to. But I summarize his orthodox innovations in three interrelated recoveries. One, of the dialectic in Marxism. Two, of the revolutionary character of the dialectic. Three, of praxis as the revolutionary lever of Marxist dialectics. Now, I'll briefly go into these, also exploring how Lukács refined his view of these recoveries between when he first formulated them in early 1919 and how he articulated them in HCC 4 years later. That gives us a clear basis of comparison because we have the original version of the essays and their modified version in HCC. So we can see exactly what he changed, how he developed, how his thinking developed. So already in the first version of What is Orthodox Marxism, for instance, published in March 1919, so before the Hungarian Revolution, Lukács categorically refutes the notion that Marx's method needs to be improved or further developed in any way. So in terms of the first recovery I referred to, the dialectic in Marxism, there's a beautiful formulation from the early version of What is Orthodox Marxism that I like very much. Quote, "Without the dialectic, we would be lost in a labyrinth of disordered facts, impossible to put in order, and whose consideration would be useless as orientation to our action." End of quote. So what is at stake is not simply an issue of how to better gain knowledge of reality, how to grasp it. Rather, of how the accurate knowledge of reality is a necessary means to effectively transform it. So rather than an epistemological issue, an issue of the relationship of knowledge and reality, we have a practical political one. Not what we can and cannot know, but how can we change things? I find it ironic that after 4 months of being a Marxist, Lukács is already stressing we should be cautious about amending Marx's method. Every attempt to do so, he would state, notably by eliminating the dialectic, has, according to Lukács, flattened Marx's method. That is, made it superficial or robbed it of its depth. Lukács will refute revisionism with the same term in both in 1919 and in the finished version of HCC, in What is Orthodox Marxism. But the key differences emerge in how he characterizes the dialectical dimension of Marxism. I'll refer to them briefly because these shifts provide clues as to why Lukács arrived at the concept of reification in the first place, because it was not present in the 1919 essays. What is common to both versions, earlier and later, is the notion that a dialectical perspective is decisive because it rejects binaries between theory and praxis, subject and object, concepts and reality. But there's a telling change of emphasis in this regard in HCC compared to his earlier formulations. In 1919, Lukács frames the dialectical unity of theory and praxis as follows, quote, "Theory can only be revolutionary insofar as it overcomes the difference between theory and practice, inasmuch as the mere fact of the correct train of thought produces an essential change in the object towards which the thought is directed. The consistent realization of the correct thought results in the transformation of reality." End of quote. In other words, effectively grasping reality immediately coincides with transforming it, to the Lukács of 1919. So in a way, he overcomes or supersedes the difference between theory and praxis. So to put it briefly, Lukács here frames overcoming the binary through the dialectical identity of the terms. Now, Constantine spoke of a Fichtean Hegelianism yesterday, referring to these passages, but I'll leave that to the philosophers. There's a passage also in the early version of What is Orthodox Marxism, where Lukács will openly refer to Hegelian dialectics, however. Lukács argues that it's revolutionary because its concepts, quote, are not rigid schemes, which once established can never be altered, end of quote. So to Hegel and to Marx following him, according to Lukács, quote, concepts are not isolated thought formations to be understood abstractly, but rather living realities which bring forth a permanent process of shifts and leaps, end of quote. In the version of What is Orthodox Marxism for History and Class Consciousness, in turn, dialectics is framed as a revolutionary method, not primarily because it grasps concepts as inherently fluid, but because it sets out from the necessary interrelationship between subject and object in the historical process. This element is crucial because it evokes praxis. Quote, in all metaphysics, the object remains untouched and unaltered so that thought remains contemplative and fails to become practical. While for the dialectical method, the central problem is to change reality. End of quote. Based on this notion, the Lukács from HCC introduces more differentiation in how he understands the unity of theory and praxis. Theory becomes, quote, the expression of the revolutionary process, that which temporarily fixated so that it may be generalized, communicated, utilized, and developed. So the unity of theory and praxis is no longer understood as simply identity, even if a dialectical one. Its function as theory changes in HCC with the introduction of the category of mediation. So here, a quote from HCC. The dialectical relationship has a dual determination, a dual mandate, if you will. Quote, the simultaneous recognition and overcoming of being in its immediacy, end of quote. Put differently, dialectics must grasp reality beyond the form in which it presents itself immediately under capitalism. And to accomplish it, it must, or the dialectical thinker must search for the mediations. As Lukács writes, the mediations that allow phenomena to be detached from the immediate form in which they are given and connected to their core or essence, while at the same time, and this is crucial, understanding that this form of appearance is a product of the historical process, hence not false in the sense of an illusion. It is rather, quote, necessary because it emerges from the soil of capitalist society, end of quote. Now, the notion that to radically transform reality, it's necessary to get to the core of the historical process through the correct class standpoint was already formulated in Lukács' very first Marxist texts. In HCC, however, this layer of appearances that makes the forms of capitalist reality seem eternal and immutable rather than historical and transitory becomes a central problem. Yet, and this is crucial, there is no one-step solution to getting to the core or essence of reality. The mode of appearance of phenomena under capitalism, which envelop all societal forms, can only be transcended when the system itself is overcome. This appearance is a necessary one. So in German, dieser Schein ist als Schein notwendig. This is where the concept of reification and its critique come in. Lukács' fundamental innovation in HCC raises the question of why capitalist society not only produces and reproduces relations of production, but also the specific mode in which they appear to its human subjects. In other words, it produces a material world, and as part of that process, a certain appearance of that world that is both rooted in the determinants of the capitalist mode of production, most notably the commodity form and its generalization, and hence is not simply an illusion you can brush aside, but an appearance that is nevertheless false if taken in its immediacy. Now, if we go back to Lukács' own development as a Marxist, it is important to stress that the concept of reification is absent in the writings of 1919. There, the standpoint of the proletariat is pretty much immediately revolutionary. Theory and praxis immediately coincide. So what changed? Did Lukács deepen his knowledge of Marxism in that interval? There is no doubt about it. And I'll come back briefly to how he read Marx and his non-Marxist readings as well in a moment. But intellectual development does not tell the whole story. Lukács experienced the defeat not only of the Hungarian Revolution he was directly involved in, forcing him to exile in Vienna, he was witness to a greater resilience of the capitalist system than the outbreak of the Russian Revolution had led many to believe. Capitalist society proved more durable even when a crisis situation and a sizable revolutionary workers' movement was present, most notably in Germany. And so The experience of defeat, despite what would appear as favorable conditions for the revolution, are what caused this visible shift of emphasis in Lukács's perspective. So Lukács's texts from early 1919 are still, Lukács also changes his interlocutors, is what I also wanted to highlight. So from critiques within the left in 1919, from social democratic reformism's inability to go beyond the limits to political actions set by the bourgeois order, to the blind spots of anarcho-syndicalists who advocated total negation, but in such an abstract manner that, just like the reformists, they failed to build towards an actual alternative. Lukács, in History and Class Consciousness, he will not abandon the critique of vulgar Marxism and ultra-leftist tendencies, but much more space is reserved to the analysis and critique of bourgeois thought and the pathways to overcome its influence in the revolutionary labor movement. So it's no coincidence in this regard that the problem of reification first appears in Lukács's work, as far as I know, in the first version of the essay on class consciousness, published in April 1920. Coming back to what the ordering of HCC tells us, as I spoke about in the introduction yesterday, the essay Class Consciousness comes immediately before the reification essay. In other words, going beyond reification emerges as a condition and indeed as a central part of the struggle to transcend the capitalist social societal order. As Lukács states in the conclusion of HCC's What is Orthodox Marxism? Quote, "The task of Orthodox Marxism, its victory over revisionism and utopianism, can never mean the defeat, once and for all, of false tendencies. It is an ever-renewed struggle against the insidious effects of bourgeois ideology on the thought of the proletariat." End of quote. In this passage, we have the structure of the reification chapter. The anatomy of the insidious, or in a closer translation, alluring effects of bourgeois ideology is presented in the essay's first part. The second part contains a critique of bourgeois thought and how it reproduces these reified forms. And the third part then approaches the revolutionary standpoint of the proletariat, through which they can be broken. And you'll hear the presentations on part 2 and 3 next, right? Here's my attempt, however, at a definition of Lukács's concept of reification that you can take with you to the next presentations. So under capitalism, subjects enter into a contemplative attitude towards objects and relationships as things. And this is concurrent with the thingification of subjects themselves as mere isolated objects by the world of those very things they have no control over. So that's my nutshell definition. I won't have time to go into Lukács's source in Marx's work for this conceptualization, but beyond the section on commodity fetishism from Capital, there is one quote from book 3 of Capital that Lukács often referred to, not only in HCC, but even in later essays, including the Young Hegel, that I want to read because it gives us all the elements that Lukács needs to build his critique of reification, even if that a fully blown theory of reified forms of appearance under capitalism is not given in Capital yet. So this is a quote from Capital. Quote, "The effects of a certain societal form of labor, i.e. labor that is based on commodity production and exchange value, are ascribed to the object, to the products of that labor. So the relationship of production itself is fantasized to exist in thing-like form, dingliche Gestalt." Marx is writing this in reference to bourgeois political economist Hodgkin, which he argues sees this reification of the attribution to things of characteristics of a form of labor, but to also argue that this political economist is incapable of understanding why these forms, this form of appearance is a necessary one, and you can't just brush it aside. So Marx will add that, quote, "In Capital, the effect which things possesses objective aspects of the labor process are attributed to them as their own properties in their personification, their autonomy with regards to labor. They would cease to have these effects if they were to cease to confront labor in this alienated form, entfremdete form." End of quote. So this is Marx in Capital. So Marx makes 2 points here. Like I said, things take a life of themselves in capitalism. This is rooted in the fact that capital, to a very real extent, exerts command over its human subjects, even if it's a product of their labor. But Marx makes a second point, that this relationship between people and what they produced, here clearly qualified as alienated by Marx, produces a fetishized representation of social relations. They appear in a thing-like form. What does that mean? And this will help us understand Lukács's own concept of reification. It means that the specific manner in which we confront both nature and other human beings under capitalism, that is through the mediation of the commodity and value forms, generalizes its appearance to all social relations. So the fact that we commodify all products of labor, hence our metabolism with nature, and most of our social relations in the form of relations of exchange and exploitation, mean that we confront them as we do commodities themselves. Hence, from a quantitative rather than qualitative perspective, in a fragmented and isolated form. Moreover, with the tendency to parcel things and people into self-contained units or segments, what we will call today product or market segments, with their own ever more formal and formally rational manner of functioning, with a corresponding level of specialization of those that produce and manipulate them. So the result is a fragmented reality where the whole is as a dead canvas of free-floating atoms and self-reference units. This is the world of reification. Lukács's innovation in this regard is understanding the universal character of this mode of appearance, the generalization of this reified objectivity to all societal phenomena under capitalism. Quote, and there is naturally no form in which human relations can be cast, Lukács argues, no way in which human beings can bring their physical and psychic qualities into play without being subjected increasingly to this reifying process. We need only think of marriage. That's his example, end of quote. I wanted to reference this passage from Capital, quoted by Lukács on several occasions, and this quote from HCC in particular, because this is where a passage in which he points to the reification of effective relations and reproduction through the marriage form, we could call it, to return to our second paradox. So the notion that Lukács is an innovative Marxist because he borrowed from non-Marxist authors. That is what a lot of the literature considers the root of Lukács's specific contribution, his diagnosis of the generalization of fetishized forms to all social phenomena, tying reification, for instance, to Max Weber's theory of rationalization. This is not without reason, yet I quoted Marx on the thing-like form taken on by relations of production to emphasize you do not need Weber to theorize reification. The reference to marriage, in turn, highlights that Engels' origin of the family and private property and the state is just as crucial a reference in the conceptualization of how the commodity form historically puts its mark on all non-economic phenomena, and in a way, even before capitalism, universalized this phenomenon. In that regard, even if, for instance, neo-Kantianism unquestionably made Lukács more sensitive to the question of the relationship between concepts and reality and what lay behind the validity of concepts, that does not make Lukács's Marxism neo-Kantian. To go beyond the second paradox of Lukács's reception, the notion that Lukács's path-breaking Marxism is owed to non-Marxist influences, we must hence grapple with two conflicting ideas in terms of Lukács's relationship to bourgeois thought. While it's undeniable that he is in dialogue with and indeed partially incorporates the results of most lucid representatives of bourgeois philosophical and social thought of his time, history and class consciousness nevertheless constitutes the most radical critique of those thoughts to date. This is best visible, and I'm coming to an end here, this is best visible in Lukács's relationship to the work of his mentors, Weber and Simmel, because it's clear that he thinks they were able to identify the phenomenon of reification, and hence he could use their work as a kind of a source of the anatomy of various aspects of the reified world, the state, the legal system, key aspects of social life. Lukács therefore relies on them for what my co-host Mariana Teixeira called the phenomenology of the delacerated subject, end of quote. But Lukács is very explicit that these same thinkers, for all their lucidity, cannot grasp, quote, the grounds, the genesis, and the necessity of the phenomenon of reification. Their inability to go beyond the reified world, indeed their critical elevation of that immediate appearance, quote, as the only possible world, the only conceptually accessible, comprehensible world presented to us humans, is rather akin to its ultimate consecration. In this regard, his relationship to a thinker like Weber mirrors Marx's relationship to bourgeois political economy. In HCC, Lukács argues that Marx, quote, explicitly attributed the mistaken ideas of bourgeois economists concerning the economic processes of capitalism to the absence of mediation, to the systematic avoidance of the categories of mediation, to the immediate acceptance of secondary forms of objectivity. And so Lukács, in a way, is highlighting how Marx criticized in bourgeois thinkers the unmediated relationship with immediate reality. So to finish, just a final point. So Lukács's effort throughout HCC with regards to this particular quote is to introduce mediations of various orders in the relationship of revolutionaries with reality so that they might go beyond its immediate forms to transform it, overcome its capitalist antagonistic form. These mediations, dialectical theory, the proletarian class standpoint, and revolutionary organization, non-coincidentally give us the structure of HCC. They also tell us that this work is one of revolutionary theory in the sense that it emerged from within a mass movement and communist organization, and more specifically, from an intellectual that embraced and intervened in a revolutionary conjuncture. If there's no revolution without revolutionary theory, the latter also feeds off what Lukács termed, in a reference to Engels, as the revolutionary life principle. That is what gives HCC its specific impulse and actuality to its wide collection of readers 100 years later. At least that's what I would argue. Thanks for your attention, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Victor. Well, after Victor's deep dive into the phenomenon of reification, we will continue the marathon with Giovanni Zanotti and Antinomies of bourgeois thought. Let me first introduce Giovanni, who is visiting associate professor at the University of Brasilia. He graduated from the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa and received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Pisa. In 2020, he published a book on the dialectical critique of Wittgenstein's philosophy. He is the Italian translator of Adorno's Hegel Three Studies and An Introduction to Dialectics. His current research deals mainly with Adorno's philosophy and with German and Brazilian critical theories, with a special focus on the nature and scope of the dialectic. Please, Giovanni, proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Costas. Thank you, everyone. Victor, it's not easy to speak after you, but thank you, and thank you, Mariana, for organizing this marathon. Thank you, thanks to Historical Materialism for giving us the possibility to do this online version of our marathon in Athens, which was really special. So I had the task to present the second paragraph of the reification essay, if not the most difficult, certainly the most esoteric one, because it's a philosophical one. I have given to my presentation the title, Only the Totality is Open, because I will insist on the concept of totality as a condition to openness, against then the prejudices about which are frequently the cases that are frequently made against the Lukács concept of totality of being epistemologically untenable and politically authoritarian. I will try to demonstrate that for Lukács at least, totality has another meaning, and that to understand that meaning, we must conceive this chapter as establishing two different attitudes toward the world. One that he calls contemplative, the other one he famously calls practical, but I will argue that this subchapter, the central part of the reification essay, is in fact dedicated to one of the two key terms of the book title, and in fact the least discussed. Yesterday we discussed about class consciousness. I will argue that this chapter is in fact dedicated to history. It's where the dimension of history emerges at the core of Lukács' argumentation for the first time, and it's displayed as the alternative to reified thought. So first of all, antinomies of bourgeois thought, what does it mean? With some degree of simplification, antinomy means a contradiction. that necessarily arises for him as the expression of capitalist society at the philosophical level, and that cannot be resolved from what he famously calls the point of view of the bourgeoisie. So he will here discuss the contradictions necessarily inherent to bourgeois philosophy, and that at the same time, so in the way of ideology critique, emerge as a necessary expression of the contradictions of bourgeois society. At the same time, so Lukács proceeds at the same time from the inside and from the outside, so to speak. Every time he uses the technical philosophical term, which is methodological immanent, with this term, he means that we have to address philosophical problems not only from the outside, not only deduce them from social being, but also to address them, so to speak, directly. And he does both in this chapter. So I want to start with asking a question that is valid for the whole of history and class consciousness, but I think specifically for this chapter. Isn't it the case that reading this chapter today involves a new antinomy, a new contradiction, a new aphoretic situation, in the sense that today, to say the least, the relationship between theory and praxis is much more mediated than in history and class consciousness time, than the time when it was written. At the same time, the book in general and this chapter in particular require from us that we read theory as Victor said, immanently, inherently connected to praxis. So we would misunderstand it and read it falsely as theory if we read it simply as theory. I will try to offer a possible way of answering this question, this new antinomy, in an Adornian way, so to speak. Meaning, by claiming that, as Adorno would later express, for Lukács already here, at least, to put it blatantly, thinking rightly already is a form of praxis. And I think Lukács describes what would be to think in a right way. And I can anticipate already now that it means thinking historically. So thinking historically is as the whole is globally a different way, an opposed way to reified thinking, which is at the core of what he calls practice. I will we will see in a moment that he defines the practical attitude in a curious way, not just as acting versus thinking. It's not just that, it's also that, of course, reminding of what the young Marx said about the weapons of critique being not enough and requiring the critique of weapons. But for Lukács here, practical attitude means a way of thinking that is ultimately amounts to historical thinking. So, and historical thinking as non-reified way of thinking involves two aspects. All the chapter is organized around the mysterious unity of these two seemingly distant aspects, which are on one side the overcoming of the form-content opposition, so formalistic thought as opposed to an impenetrable content on one side. On the other side, the overcoming of the part-whole opposition, so totality versus fragment. And it's here that I will argue, as anticipated, that totality is the very condition, in one sense, of an open thinking, as counterintuitive as it might sound. So I will start with form and content, and start precisely from these two famous terms that are introduced, I think, here, or at least discussed here at length for the first time in this chapter: contemplative and practical attitude. It is not neither a mere opposition of theory and action, but it's also not a mere opposition of individual and collective. At one point, Lukács says that the antinomy of contemplation, in the sense of purely theoretical thinking reproduces itself in Kant's critique of pure reason, in as much as the Kantian ethics only conceives of action in individual terms. So there is this layer, but he adds something more. And I quote this at the first sight, very obscure sentence, and I will try to make it less obscure. I quote, "It is not enough that the attempt should be made to transcend the contemplative attitude. When the question is formulated more concretely, it turns out that the essence of praxis consists in annulling that indifference of form towards content." So the problem is indifference of form towards content, the opposition between form and content. And what he calls practical is to overcome that opposition. When we overcome that opposition, we are already practical in Lukács's sense. I will just start from a start. There are many premises already, but this is the last one, from a general consideration. In the same year as History and Class Consciousness, another similar, much less sophisticated book was published, Karl Korsch, Marxism and Philosophy. But Korsch makes an interesting point, a very curious point that I think may help us by contrast, by comparison, to illuminate Lukács's point too. He says the second international Marxism neglected the problem of philosophy in the sense that they conceived it as already overcome by science. They neglected philosophy for the same reason. The reason was the same as for their neglecting the problem of state, according to Lenin, because both the problem of philosophy and the problem of state relate to the problem of revolution. So what does this mean? It means that philosophy entails the subjective moment, as Alexandros argued yesterday, the moment of freedom, the moment of subjectivity. And so the moment of revolution, as opposed to a mechanistic and evolutionary conception of the transition to socialism. But as compared to Korsch's point, look, which as an aside, I think it's crucial for the whole of Adorno's thought, but Lukács here adds an important paradox, an important dialectical reversal, because for Lukács, this is his whole point in this chapter. Free subjectivity is realized in correctly grasping objectivity, in grasping reality as it is. And conversely, the contradiction of bourgeois thought is that precisely the impossibility to grasp objectivity opposes the bourgeois subject to a purely objective world. So subjectivism reverts itself, thought pure subjectivism is reverted in pure objectivism. I will try now to make it a bit clearer, a bit more meaningful. So starting from the basics, I think a possible way of addressing Lukács's discussion of bourgeois philosophy from Descartes to Kant and Hegel, basically in this chapter, is to conceive it, the parallelism between bourgeois society and bourgeois philosophy. In fact, he states that very explicitly, and considering both as what I would define as a system which fails. Both dimensions, society and philosophy, are for Lukács attempts at totalization, which nonetheless necessarily fail in their very attempt to totalize. Why is that the case with bourgeois society? Because, as Marx argues in the famous fetish character chapter, capitalism is the product of unsocial or mediately social labor, so private labor. Private labors result in a social objectivity, into the social objectivity of capital, which forms a totality that nonetheless it's not constituted by immediately social labor, planned labor. So it is a totality, differently from pre-capitalistic societies, but it is a totality which is not transparent to itself, and therefore it is contradictory, which raises the question of whether, not only whether there is a dialectic of nature, according to Marx and Lukács here, but also whether there are pre or post-capitalist dialectics. So I think that, I tend to think that for Marx, as the Neue Marxlekture argued, and for Lukács here, dialectic is what is most distant from an ontology. Not only it is not or insufficiently applied to nature, but also for the same reasons to pre and post-capitalistic society. So dialectic as a contradictory totality is what is specifically capitalist. I will skip the quotation. So the point is, the famous point is that what is human, the product of human individual activities, results into impenetrable social natural laws. And for the same reason, that's the point, the whole is fragmented into parts whose mutual connection is what he calls accidental and mechanical. So the parts in capitalism are rationalized, but they are not harmonized from the beginning by mutual agreement, but only in an unconscious way. So from the outside, in an inorganic, in a mechanical way, resulting in chaos, anarchy of production, crisis. So rationality of the part, irrationality of the whole, in this very specific sense. And modern philosophy obeys, from Descartes to Kant, basically, obeys exactly the same structure. So for the first time, it's the attempt of rationalizing, unifying, and so totalizing human knowledge, starting from what the subject does. But at the same time, what the subject does is just formalizing and in order to calculate and dominate sectors of reality, what Lukács calls the formal partial systems. So for example, right, the economy, the special sciences, or special sectors within these disciplines, with the consequence that, with a double consequence. And that's the point. That's one of Lukács's points, that, as anticipated, an irrational residue remains in relation to both the material, qualitatively specific content as opposed to form, and totality as opposed to fragments. He says that both aspects are summarized into Kant's concept of the thing in itself. The subjective forms cannot grasp the qualitative, the material, the individual object, the content outside form. And for the same reason, they can't grasp totality, so God, world, the soul, etc. And Lukács argues, and it is his main concern throughout this chapter, to demonstrate why these two seemingly opposed aspects, so totality and individual material content, are in fact one and the same problem. The reason is because the same mental process that abstracts form from the content also condemns form to reduce itself to a partial system, to a fragment. And that becomes much more understandable if we think about the social basis, because it's what happens in capitalist society. The same happens in bourgeois philosophy. I will clarify this. I'm finishing, just 5-6 more minutes, by arguing what is for Lukács the opposite of this, which is historical thinking. But I'd like to focus first on a so-called digression, which is not a digression, on Engels and the thing in itself. Here, Lukács, in fact, it's not a digression, it's central to his point to criticize Engels's industrial, scientific, in bourgeois sense, conception of the overcoming of the thing in itself, in as much as for Engels, Kant's thing in itself is overcome by experiment and industry, so science and technique. And Lukács argues this is still a contemplative attitude, precisely insofar as what the subject of science and technique does is the same as the capitalist economic agent does. He knows and he uses what is opposed to him in the form of a positivity, of an already given external law, but without conceiving of this law as in its unity with the subject. It's produced by the subject. I quote, Engels' deepest misunderstanding consists in his belief that the behavior of industry and scientific experiment constitutes praxis in the dialectic philosophical sense. In fact, scientific experiment is contemplation as at its purest. All this, as I was saying, as I was suggesting, becomes much more clearer in the last 6-7 pages of the chapter, which appear to me to be maybe the most inspired, enthusiastic pages of the whole book. Because here Lukács gives the impression to believe he has found the secret, the mystery. And the secret is nothing else than the historical perspective. So we have proletariat, as Mariana will explain to us, as the identical subject-object of history. The proletariat is in the conditions of conceiving history as its own product, and at the same time itself as an historical product. So to abolish, to overcome the form-content, the subject-object opposition, and for the same reason, the fragment-totality opposition. Why for the same reason? Because it's capable of historical thinking. Because history, what Lukács here calls a logic of changing contents, is the only way of thinking in which what is qualitatively unique, the new, what he calls the new, the historically new, historical becoming, can be grasped together with totality. I will read just the second part of this quotation. And I've underlined precisely insofar, because I think if we understand this precisely insofar, we understand Lukács' point. So I quote, precisely insofar as a knowledge adequate to historical process is compelled to construct its conceptual system upon content and upon what is qualitatively unique and new in the phenomena, it is compelled at the same time not to let any of these elements to maintain its mere concrete and repeatable character, but to situate them within the concrete totality of the historical world, the total and concrete historical process itself as their own intelligible dimension. So in historical thinking, in formal thinking, we have a fixed domain, a fixed sector of reality, which is conceived in formal terms as immutable laws. And so we have at the same time the fragment and the static fixation. What is isolated is also for the same reason immutable. On the contrary, in historical thinking, it is so to speak, to situate what is unrepeatable in its own place, which is its place and of nothing else, also at the same time allows to see it in a concrete dynamic totality. I will just read and then conclude a quotation from Benedetto Croce, from the Breviary of Aesthetics of 1913, which had been translated quite early into German. So I won't exclude the direct influence of this passage by Croce on Lukács, but in any case, the conceptual comparison is striking. Croce says, I quote, "By denying theoretical value to abstract classifications, we did not mean to deny it value to that genetic and concrete classification, which is not mere classification and which is called history. In history, each work of art takes its rightful place, that and no other." He's speaking about works of art, aesthetic classifications. "And in history, one finds the link of all works of art, because in history they appear organically connected." So it's the same precisely insofar of Lukács. Precisely insofar the individual, the particular, is grasped in its concreteness, it is also grasped in its concrete link to synchronic and diachronic totality. So to conclude, totality. The extensive notion of totality as the sum of all aspects of reality is a formal notion, and then it still belongs to reified thought, Lukács would argue. On the contrary, Lukács has an intensive concept of totality, which means something like, so to speak, totality is a spontaneous meaning intrinsic to every single aspect of reality, a meaning that flows from the inside of the individual aspect, connecting it from the inside to a global process to which the knowing subject belongs as its self-consciousness. So totality is historical, as historical being. Partial systems are ahistorical. I quote, "Rationalist thought, by concerning itself with the formal calculability of the contents of form made abstract, must define these contents as immutable within the systems of relations obtaining at any given time, with the consequence that only the totality is open and fragments are closed." Just one final remark about the political consequences. Well, first, for Lukács, only the proletariat is capable of historical thinking, because its own class interest is to tend to a self-transparent totality, so to a system that does not fail, both in society and in self-understanding and in theory, in philosophy. Proletariat is for Lukács the identical subject-object, not as the absolute, not even merely as an oppressed group. This about the discussion about on feminist standpoint theories and so on. I think there is something more specific here. It's not the identical subject-object as an oppressed group simply, but as the self-consciousness of a totality, of a historical whole that is specifically capitalistic. Second point, second political consequence. There is just like for Lenin, opportunism and anarchism reverse into one another. At the same time, I think we could say that for Lukács, there is a dialectical mutual reversal of subjectivism, of realpolitik and of utopianism, in the sense that realpolitik, in conceiving reality as something external, estranged, opaque, and not as a product of the subject, reduces itself to subjectivism, to not grasping the object. At the same time, utopianism, voluntarism, spontaneism, and so on, have a degree of objectivist passivity, in as much as, for the same reason, because they tend to impress a meaning to an estranged reality, instead of conceiving themselves as the self-consciousness of the objectivity itself. This is what Lukács calls historical character. Third, yesterday Alexandros asked what was Lukács' enemy. Not speaking of enemies, because there are no enemies among comrades, but I might ask, to be highly provocative, against which limits Lukács' perspective on practical historical thinking might help us today to find a better solution. I think there are two on the philosophical, political level. There is, on one side, a certain culturalist, spontaneistic, voluntaristic tendency that is commonly ascribed to post-structuralist thought, to simplify at most, the new Hegelian left somehow. But there is also a new Hegelian right, some traditional Marxism, which some non-dialectical Marxism that from Second International passed into the Third International. And I wonder if, despite all sophistications, the late Lukács might not be included into this non-dialectical version of Marxism, precisely because of his insistence on ontology. Maybe, but I will leave that for discussion later and maybe also tomorrow. Maybe the standpoint of ontology as a description of something that is in general presupposes a contemplative and ahistorical standpoint in the sense of the HCC Lukács, but that's a provocation that I will, as said, leave for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for your thought-provoking presentation and the provocative comments in the end. I think that they will be very helpful for the discussion. And now we will proceed with Mariana Teixeira and the standpoint of the proletariat. Mariana is an assistant researcher at the Praxis Research Group of the University of Lisbon in Portugal and member of the editorial board of Dissonância Critical Theory Journal. She earned her PhD from the University of Campinas in Brazil and was a postdoctoral researcher at the Free University Berlin in Germany. Her scholarly work focuses mainly on critical theory, feminism, Marxist and Hegelian dialectics, and the peripheries of capital. Mariana, the floor is yours. You're muted, Mariana. You can begin whenever you want.
Sorry, my mic was off. Thank you, Kostas, for your introduction. Thank you all for being here for this second day of our marathon. I have now the difficult task of closing off the chapter on reification after two very interesting and provoking presentations, so I'll do my best. I'll discuss the last part of the essay. It's called The Standpoint of the Proletariat, and it is focused on the possibility of overcoming capitalism and reification, while the first two parts, discussed now by Victor and Giovanni, laid out in great detail the pervasiveness of reification. In my presentation, I'll first briefly reconstruct Lukács' arguments for claiming that the standpoint of the proletariat is capable of grasping capitalist society in its totality, and then go on to draw some observations about the afterlife of this highly contested and yet, in my view, pregnant idea. So I'll go a little bit in another direction, not try to focus too much on the way that led to Lukács writing this chapter, but rather what happened after it, so the reception of this idea. So the third section of the reification chapter is further divided into 6 subparts. These titles are mine. Lukács didn't name them, but that's how I tried to organize these 6 subsections. And let's go to the first one that I'm calling immediacy and mediation. In the first part of this section, Lukács shows how immediacy and mediation are moments of the dialectical process of totality. He points out that it is necessary to start from immediacy, but that it is also necessary not to stop there, but to seek to overcome this immediacy through the mediations that underlie any given objective reality. Lukács also stresses that this is precisely what the bourgeois thought is unable to do. Its contemplative attitude prevents it from pointing beyond immediate givens, and thereby it suppresses history. as we have just seen in both parts preceding this one, especially the second part on the antinomies of bourgeois thought. So the second subsession I named the standpoint of totality. And in this part, perhaps one of the most important of the essay, Lukács sets out the reasons why only the proletariat can have access to the standpoint of totality that allows the overcoming of reified reality. For Lukács, both the proletarian and the bourgeois have their consciousness reified, but the proletarian experiences this reification in his own immediate reality, and going beyond it appears for him as a matter of life and death. The bourgeois, by contrast, feels comfortable in his reification, since in his immediate reality, he appears not as an object, but rather as the subject of that reality. This amounts to why each class has an opposing impulse towards overcoming reification. But moreover, the reason that the workers can perceive the existence of reification is because they sell only a portion of their faculties, their labor force, as a commodity, while the members of the bourgeoisie sell the whole of their personality, their entire soul. The third part points to the fact that the proletariat can be recognized as the true subject of history when it overcomes the immediacy of reified reality and moves from the self-consciousness of the commodity to the self-consciousness of society in its historical development. In the fourth part, Lukács claims that with the abandonment of purely immediate reality, the very conception of reality is altered. When free from the bounds of immediacy, the facts, in quotation, and it's interesting that he always uses the term facts with quotation marks. So when free from the bounds of immediacy, the facts that make up the empirical reality can be considered less real than the general tendencies of total development. The tendencies contain the general meaning of historical development, the movement of totality, and not mere facts, crystallized and naturalized, not dissolved into processes. In this process, Lukács argues in the fifth part, the human being has become the measure of all things, but not just any individual human being, the concrete, social, historical human being embedded in society. In other words, the class. Lukács' aim here is to dispel both dogmatic and relativistic stances. Finally, in the sixth part, Lukács summarizes the main ideas present in the essay, especially with regard to the relationship between being and thinking and the role of praxis. He ends the text with a reminder that the historical development has thus far placed the proletariat in the position where the transformation of society is both possible and necessary, but that this transformation must be the free act of the proletariat itself. So as we can see, Lukács ends this section and the reification chapter as a whole in a rather optimistic note. In the early 20s, a proletarian revolution on a large and even global scale seemed not only possible and necessary, but almost imminent. And Lukács' text meant to conceptualize the unique potentiality inherent in the position of the proletariat to carry out such revolution.
Mariana, sorry to interrupt you. Just if you can to put the slides on display, we now see multiple slides.
Oh, really?
So that it is easier to read each one of them. Sorry for the interruption.
No, no problem. Now, is it, can you see just one now?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much.
Okay. So since then, from this time in the 20s where a revolution was in the horizon, Since then, as the prospect of a world revolution faded farther and farther in the horizon, so did Lukács' theory of the standpoint of the proletariat fall under attack until it faded into oblivion. While his account of reification is still considered to be very perceptive to understand contemporary phenomena of capitalist society, the theory of the standpoint of the proletariat often appears as an outdated workerism that has been disproved in the court of history and serves more as a document to remember a somewhat naive and distant past than as a conceptual tool with which to address the present. I would like to claim, however, that to grasp the essay's full potential, the two levels of Lukács' essay, the diagnosis of the pervasiveness of reification, which are the first two chapters, on the one hand, and the possibility of its overcoming, which is related to the standpoint grounded in its contradictions on the other, which is the topic of the third part, should not be read separately from one another. So, on the one hand, reification without standpoint. The tendency to discard Lukács' approach to the uniqueness of the standpoint of the proletariat and focus on his conceptualization of reification appears, for example, in the fact that the first part of the essay is often read separately in academia and sometimes even published separately. This dismissal of the discussion on standpoint of the proletariat can also be seen in an explicit manner, for example, in Max Horkheimer's inaugural text on traditional and critical theory, when he says that the truth can no longer be considered to be destined to any predetermined group, and in Habermas' criticism of the proletariat as a mythological macro subject in his theory of communicative action. Also, Honneth has a text on Lukács from the 90s, I think, where he considers that Lukács is a very good seismograph, or that device used for measuring earthquakes. So he makes a very good diagnosis, but his conception, for example, of the standpoint of the proletariat is something that needs to be left in the past. So this pessimism with regard to the revolutionary potential inherent in the position of the proletariat might be understandable under the circumstances in which these texts were written. The mass adherence of the German workers to National Socialism in the case of Horkheimer, and their integration into the post-war social democratic order in the case of Habermas. But it seems that this position misses Lukács' point that, and I quote, as the antagonism becomes more acute, two possibilities open up for the proletariat. It is given the opportunity to substitute its own positive contents for the emptied and bursting husks, but also it is exposed to the danger that for a time at least, it might adapt itself ideologically to conform to these, the emptiest and most decadent forms of bourgeois culture. End of quotation. So this echoes the distinction between empirical and imputed consciousness, which he develops in more detail in the chapter on class consciousness that was presented yesterday by Eden Young. There are differences between the class consciousness and chapter and this section on the standpoint of the proletariat, and Eden pointed to some of them yesterday, but both texts refuse any empiricist, immediate, and crystallized reliance on the subjective belief of individual workers. Perhaps here it would make more sense to talk about the distinction between immediate and mediated class consciousness. For Lukács, moreover, the reification and the standpoint of the proletariat as the standpoint of totality are internally connected. It is in the nature of reification, in, I quote, the formal character of its own rationality, end of quotation, that is, as opposed to the living content of the human exchange with nature and other humans. So it's in the nature of reification to create its own limits and therefore the possibility of its overcoming precisely from the standpoint at which this contradiction is experienced in its most acute form. The other side of the coin, the standpoint without reification. So I would like now to turn to the other side of this coin, namely the afterlife of the idea of a privileged standpoint from which to observe and understand society and what happens when it loses its connection to an analysis of reification. That is, when we have a standpoint without reification. While today few people would claim Lukács's account of the standpoint of the proletariat exactly as he formulated 100 years ago, and we can't forget that later in his life, Lukács himself became a harsh critic of his early work, there have been attempts to actualize it and thereby to put it to good use. One such attempt was carried out by feminist Marxists, especially from the 1970s on, producing a strand of thought known as feminist standpoint theory. In fact, two of the main proponents of this approach, Sandra Harding and Nancy Hartzog, draw explicitly on Lukács to make the case for the emancipatory potential lying dormant in women's experiences in patriarchal capitalist societies. My aim here is not to address the convergences and divergences between this trend of feminist thought and Lukács's conception of the standpoint of the proletariat. For those interested in this topic, I developed some observations about this complex relationship in a book chapter titled Delaceration and Emancipatory Interest. But to deal with this issue in an adequate manner, it would be necessary to delve more deeply into other areas, such as, for example, the feminist theory of social reproduction, as was very aptly suggested by Ankita yesterday. And I cannot do that here. My aim, rather, is to draw attention to a more recent trend in the field of epistemology that is sometimes taken as a direct byproduct of feminist standpoint theories. In the last decades, the conception that all knowledge is situated and that this is a valuable epistemic factor, rather than a failure in reaching purely objective science, has been gaining increasing currency in academia. This stance has the merit of challenging the mainstream assumption that knowledge is, or should be, neutral, disembodied, and value-free. However, we should make it clear that a purely perspectivist approach was not what Lukács developed in the reification essay. His point was not that since all knowledge is produced from specific positions in society, the more the merrier when it comes to piling up perspective on top of perspective in order to attain a picture of society as diversified and exhaustive as possible. Quite the contrary, Lukács was very critical of the idea that to understand reality as a totality would require aggregating as many particular descriptions as possible in order to paint an extremely detailed canvas. He argued that there is a standpoint that allows for a qualitatively more penetrating insight, one that is capable of tearing a hole in the view of reified thought, not because it points to the bad infinity of perpetual addition, but because it is repeatedly compelled to bring to light the internal connections and mediations between isolated facts manifested, and these mediations are manifested in the form of processes and tendencies. So from the standpoint of totality, it is not possible to see things as they really are, so to speak, as if it could access the Kantian things in themselves, but to meaningfully grasp their genesis and their position in the broader context in which they are embedded. In Hegelian terms, the object of knowledge from this standpoint is not being, but becoming. And in a world characterized by reified contradictions between mediation and immediacy, between living and dead labor, content and form, labor and capital, forms of subjectivity and forms of objectivity, etc., the standpoint that has the potential to grasp the underlying mediations and to do so in the form of praxis is the standpoint in the core of these relentless contradictions, which in turn relentlessly pushes it forward. For this reason, I think it's important to emphasize the difference between standpoint and viewpoint, or in German, Standpunkt and Gesichtspunkt. Of course, the terms are mostly synonymous, but etymologically, one stresses a spatiality where one is, where one stands with their whole body, as a whole being surrounded by the world, while the other alludes to a disembodied way of seeing the world, in a way almost disconnected from it. And I'm going to the concluding remarks. Now, of course, there are a lot of issues in Lukács' proposal that I have not addressed and that need further development and discussion. My aim has been solely to argue that an interconnected reading of the two levels of Lukács' essay, that is the level of reification and the level of the standpoint of totality, makes the reading of the central chapter of History and Class Consciousness more interesting and productive for us today. I have the impression, although I cannot go deeper into this here, that maybe posing the discussion in these terms might even help to illuminate the debate about intersectional struggles without falling into two traps. On the one hand, a radical pluralism that considers all standpoints as equally sound and forceful and ends up homogenizing them, or a doctrinary refusal to engage seriously with what he labels in a derogatory manner as identitarian struggles. To conclude, I would like to briefly take up again the question about the notion of class consciousness that I posed yesterday after Eden's presentation on Lukács' essay on this topic. I manifested the worry that the term consciousness might lead to an individualistic understanding of political praxis, even though that's not Lukács' intention, of course. But the mediations between individual and the collective, the mediation between the individual and the collective levels is indeed turned more complicated when we use a category that is historically tied to the notion of individuality, consciousness, sometimes posited as its very defining feature. More than that, I think the category of consciousness also suggests a cognitivist approach to praxis, whereby one acts only after achieving consciousness about something, whereas it is in praxis that consciousness is produced and reproduced. That's why I tend to prefer the term class standpoint to class consciousness as a way to try and make the relational and practical dimension of Lukács' approach more visible. And with this, I end my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mariana. All three presentations were really great. Well, at this point, I would also like to thank Historical Materialism for hosting this event at its YouTube channel, and Paul Reynolds for all his constant support. Please support and subscribe to Historical Materialism, research in critical Marxist thought, and join all the Historical Materialism conferences around the world. Well, now we already have at least 4 questions from fellow co-marathoners, and I will start with these questions, and at the same time you can post your questions at the live chat in the YouTube channel. So the first question. Mariana, to Victor and Giovanni. So I would like both of you to comment on the following. Considering how Lukács conceives the relation between subject and object in History and Class Consciousness, do you agree with his 1967 self-criticism that he had collapsed reification and objectification?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mariana. The first thing I have to say is that I will go really deep into this in the next session, because I think the passage that most clearly can lead to this kind of appreciation of his own work is in the chapter on historical materialism's change of function. But I won't run away from the question entirely. The first thing that I would do, confronted with these kinds of questions that emerge again and again, and in part from Lukács, the elder Lukács, reading his own book himself, I think the first thing we have to do, I guess, is not factionalize the discussion immediately. So I guess more than taking a position for or against Lukács in this case, I guess the main question is this reading of History and Class Consciousness possible? And my answer is yes. There are passages where it's hard to distinguish overcoming alienation and overcoming objectification or Vergegenständlichung itself. And I'll quote these passages in the next presentation. But again, this is not really a question of exegesis. I think we can't solve it through this pathway alone. And because the opposite question, which is this the only reading possible from history and class consciousness? My answer is no, it is not. There are tensions. You cannot also categorically say that there's an identification between alienation and objectification in the work. And crucially, something you said, Mariana, is very important. This only becomes clear when we're talking about overcoming alienation or overcoming reification. That's when, if you overcome objectivity or objectification, if you overcome necessity, all these questions then suddenly become more acute. While we're still theorizing reification, this is all very abstract, and the question doesn't even pose itself, because the question is there when he's doing the anatomy of the reified appearances, whether transcending it, what kind of relationship to reality that is not very clear. So what the political stakes of the question you raised, they don't emerge. And so without then going into the question that I will go later, I think what are also interesting questions that go beyond exegesis that we need to raise to approach this kind of issue. It's who is Lukács writing this book against? This is something that Giovanni mentioned. And he's writing against the Second International, against the positivistic Marxism that is very deterministic, that has a mechanistic view of how materiality and consciousness interact. And this had very clearly frozen social democrats into either expecting the social development to bring the revolution by itself, or an ethics a totally subjectivistic ethics that was necessary to break the frozen nature of a situation, a reactionary situation. And he's arguing against both of these. And of course, he's not only arguing against the social democrats, he's writing after the Russian Revolution, where it seems he has palpable proof that you can break through not only the structures of the capitalist mode of production, but how it presents itself, its ideology, all of its defense mechanisms, we can say. And here it's very interesting because he and I think it's important to point to the historical context and who is debating against, because he's not alone in this. And for example, the young Gramsci comes to very similar conclusions. And this is not a coincidence, right? He also finds in a praxis-centered Marxism the way to overcome a positivistic, mechanistic view of Marxism, of social reality. But he also coincides with the issues of the young Gramsci, whereas he goes when he goes too far with the praxis-centered perspective, and I'll go into that. Also coincide maybe with the limits of Lukács when he talks about transcending objectification, or at least when we can imply that, and so or we can interpret that. So in a way, the question is, who is he discussing against, and what are the consequences of his emphasis on praxis for his view of Marxism? And that's precisely what happens, I guess. If you have a praxis-centered view of Marxism, the risk is that the limits to that praxis, or the determinations that embed in which that praxis is embedded, and so the fact that you can't just change the world completely to your own will, or to bend it to your own will, is where you can't. It's the risk of this kind of position, and of course, the consequence with regards to where's the role of nature then, and what roles does nature play, and natural limits, and the question of the metabolism with nature itself. When you have this praxis-centered view, it necessarily emerges, and it is a question that is raised. If in a totally praxis-centered perspective, what is the role of the metabolism with nature, with the fact that nature's that society is also part of nature, and you have extra human nature and their interaction. All these questions that today are so key arise, I think, from a praxis-centered Marxist perspective. And it's also no accident that this is precisely what his early readers, the Borin and Rudas, they freak out exactly where it seems that Lukács abandoned any idea of a material determination of subjective activity, right? So just to finish, this is already a long kind of answer, but because Giovanni also asks something that goes in this direction, maybe we can listen to Giovanni, and I can go back to a second point on this that refers to his particular answer with regards to the consequence of abandoning a practice-centered Marxism or referring to its limits. But so let's hear Giovanni.
Thank you, Victor. Before hearing Giovanni, I would like to ask Giovanni to both comment on Mariana's question about objectification and reification, and to one more question together from another co-marathoner. Thank you very much, Konstantinos, for your question to Giovanni. I will read it because it is not posted in the YouTube live chat, so the online audience should hear it as well. If it follows from capitalism necessarily being contradictory, that only capitalism can be a contradictory totality, then would that mean that for Lukács in History and Class Consciousness there can be no alienation in socialism? Giovanni?
Yes, okay. So there are two historians of philosophy in this panel and one sociology who is very familiar with philosophy. So it is a philosophical discussion. So it pays the cost of being somehow more abstract than in other panels. But I think it's a good thing to take time to discuss apparently abstract issues because of the mediations that connect them to more practical ones. Both questions, Mariana's and Konstantin's, ultimately refers to the problem of the relationship between the early and late Lukács. And it is a problem, the relationship between the early and late Lukács, a big political and still open problem. Because, for example, not only a lot of contemporary Marxist thinkers internationally, I'm thinking of my fellow Italian Lo Surdo, clearly draw on the late Lukács thinking, but I would say that a large part of debates among the left somehow relate to this problem. For example, the entire first generation of the Frankfurt School is famously inspired by the HCC Lukács. It's not the young Lukács, because the young Lukács wasn't a Marxist yet, but let's say the HCC Lukács. Well, for example, if one looks at the very influential critique that Habermas made against Adorno, it has Habermas' position, for example, relating with Nietzsche, and Nietzsche, the Nietzschean left has much in common with the late Lukács position. And at the same time, what Habermas says about French post-structuralism can be related to this kind of discussion. So I think that in a more or less mediated way, a large part of the philosophical discussions in the left altogether depend on the problem, what do we do of the late Lukács if we attach value to the early one, or vice versa, So this is just a premise, because I think we still have a lot to discuss, maybe not just in this marathon. It would be worth to have a place to discuss it thoroughly. I would think the following. Yes, in the 67 preface, Lukács says that around 1930, he suddenly discovered Marx's manuscripts, and there Marx says that not every objectification is alienated, So human beings objectify themselves in both alienated and non-alienated ways. And he suddenly realized that his position in HCC was unilateral. I am always impressed by this kind of self-critique, because it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that every time that Lukács compares his later position to his previous one, there is like a dramatic reduction in conceptual sophistication, which cannot be imputed to a change in Lukács' personal biography, but must have to do with a theoretical problem, a still open one. I mean, first, it strikes that throughout history and class consciousness, he referred in a very innovative way and in a very deep and subtle way to the capital, while to announce his sudden change of position, it is necessary to refer to 1844 manuscripts, so to the young Marx. And second, I don't think that, not I don't think that, I'm sure that by reading it in History and Class Consciousness, he ignored that human beings objectified themselves, as if someone could ignore that in the first place. The point is another one, is that what he later calls non-alienated objectification does not in fact fall under his critique in History and Class Consciousness, which is a critique of reification as such. And if he speaks of an overcome of objectivity as such, is because he has an Hegelian position according to which nature is superseded in history. And so by superseding alienation, social reified objectification, we somehow supersede objectivity as such. Okay, it is debatable, this position. For example, just to not to open another chapter, but for example, just to introduce what I think might be a fruitful debate in the future, or tomorrow, I don't know, on Thursday. Adorno makes the same kind of objections to the early Lukács that the late Lukács makes to himself. So to have neglected the residue, the non-identical objectual residue, not absorbable into subjectivity, but he does so precisely by radicalizing the dialectical standpoint of Lukács as opposed to formal analytical reified thought, in a way that is itself abstruse and complicated but the Adorno's idea of a primacy of the object, which nonetheless is mediated by the subject, is precisely the idea of keeping history and class consciousness while addressing the problems that the late Lukács addresses to himself, to his previous self. Whereas, and I'm concluding, the late Lukács, it seems to me, simply falls back into a not pre-critical but pre-dialectical position, even though he keeps talking about dialectics. And to answer Constantine, which we will not agree in the least with what I've just said, yes, I think that for Lukács there is no reification in socialism, at least as a structural phenomenon, because reification is by its definition capitalism specific. I would say that the answer to that question is simpler than the answer to the question whether there is dialectic or not in capitalism. But since I think, I'm not sure, I think one can deduce that from his positions. I don't know if you would defend this, but I think that dialectics is coextensive with reification. One could also say that there is no dialectics in socialism, of course, in full displayed socialism, because the problem is if what the late Lukács called socialism was in fact socialism. This is a primary historical political problem for all historical materialists, but I will not speak longer.
Thank you, Giovanni. We have two more questions. I would like to ask you to keep your answers a bit shorter, if it's possible. The next question is by Victor to Mariana. I will read it for the online audience. Mariana, you brought a very interesting quote about the limits of reification residing in the condition and standpoint of those that experience it most acutely, the proletariat. But I have heard this at times be understood as alienation being a necessary condition for a revolutionary standpoint to arise. So alienation, reification as a platform to objectivity, transformation of reality. Isn't that a problematic extrapolation of quotes like the one you mentioned?
Thank you, Victor. I try to understand your question. I think there are two ways of understanding. Maybe that's a third one. You let me know if what you mean is any of these two options. I mean, the first option, which I don't think is what you meant, is the idea that there has to be alienation in society for a revolutionary standpoint to exist. And to this, I would answer that yes, of course, because otherwise there would be no need to transform reality. So we have to have reification to have a process of emancipation. So that's a first more simple way of understanding it. And the other one would be more on an individual level, that subjects must be experiencing themselves this alienation or reification in order to achieve a revolutionary standpoint. Is it in this direction that you mean your question? Yeah, so it's an important question, and I think this is a danger that we have, to think about these sort of things in these individual terms. So, and to think about depending on a certain subject to have a standpoint. And as I tried to criticizing the idea of perspective and even consciousness, is that it might lead to this understanding that you have to have a subject with a certain experience that achieves a certain consciousness and then acts in a revolutionary way. And I would go more in the direction, as Eden talked about yesterday, of a standpoint as the self-realization of the proletariat, as a form of praxis and not a form of knowledge that you attain because you are you have a certain experience. But I think that it is an interesting insight of Lukács that there is a tendency in these subjects that experience this reification to go against it. Experience it in this way, because as I pointed out, the bourgeois, the capitalist also experiences reification, but in a different way. It's an concealed way. So it's not something that the proletariat experiences in a more immediate form. So there is that's the seed of an impulse towards going against it, because the proletariat is for Lukács the subject of history, the subject object of history, but there would be no impulse towards making this status a reality if there were not this experience of reification. So I think it's not what makes the standpoint possible, but it's a tendency that points towards an impulse, a motor to the class as a whole collectively to achieve the standpoint, which is not, again, it's not consciousness in the sense, in the more common sense of let's make a awareness campaign among workers. No, it's not, nothing to do with that. Sorry, if my answer was a bit long, then I'll stop there.
No. It was great. So I will proceed with one more question to Giovanni by another co-marathoner, Dimitra Alfieraki. Giovanni, you underlined at the end of your talk that proletariat is not merely an oppressed social group. Could you explain the difference between the category of proletariat versus working class and the problems that occur when treated as identical? How does totality determine this distinction?
Okay, so I will try to answer very, very briefly and I will answer first by making myself a question, a very brief question to Mariana, and you, Costas, decide if it is for now or for later, but it's something that Mariana's presentation inspired to me. My question to Mariana is just to, if Mariana, you can tell us something more about that very stimulating idea and your conclusions in the part of open questions on the effect of your discussion of Lukács to the effect on your discussion of Lukács to intersectional struggles, because what Dimitra's question relates to, the part of my presentation it relates to, was meant to hint at this problem. Proletariat and working class, Dimitra, I think it's a distinction important for debates in Marxist social sciences, which I'm not familiar with. So I cannot answer directly on that. But I would say that proletariat could be, I think, used as a synonymous for working class as specifically capitalist working class. So that was my point, that for Lukács, proletariat is the identical subject-object of history in the sense we discussed. So as the subject that can think and act in a non-reified way, precisely because it can build a self-transparent totality, differently from the not self-transparent totality, which is both bourgeois society and philosophy. But to do it can do that, the proletariat, because it lives in a totality, although not self-transparent. So I think it's important to stress that the strategic role that Lukács attributes to the proletariat is directly linked with the historical specificity of capitalism itself as a totality, as an impersonally socialized system. So as a socialized system, although in an impersonal and indirect and distorted way. So in this sense, I would think that the already existing totality, which I've called the system which fails, is the precondition to think proletariat in the way Lukács does.
Thank you, Giovanni. Well, I think that we're proceeding to the end, but we have another 3-4 minutes, so I would allow for some final comments, all of you. So, Victor, would you like to start with some final thoughts? Please keep it at 1-2 minutes.
Yeah. Sure. One thing just about the proletariat and working class, it's important to point out that Lukács sees the proletariat in history class consciousness also as a totality, not only as a collectivity. And by that, he very much means the world proletariat. So he sees this class from a global standpoint, not only in its different national units. And this is very much a feature of his view of the proletariat. I guess just to finish, my last comment is we can't look in history and class consciousness for a guarantee to a correct Marxism, right? If we quote Stuart Hall, Marxism has to be without guarantees. And so he's struggling against a specific deviation in a way, or in that moment in time in the 1920s. And in the ontology, I would say he's struggling against another, but very much struggling. And that is Stalinism, right? And I'll go back to that in the next presentation, but I don't think no matter what reading we do, that we can arrive at a Marxist with guarantees. We have to stick with them without it and keep struggling, not to fall toward both sides of the subjectivist, objectivist danger, let's say. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Victor, you can go on for another 2 minutes if you want. So if you try to keep it too short.
Oh, okay. Okay. So if just to explain what I mean, if Giovanni very clearly points out that an ontology can go into a positivistic mechanistic direction, and that's where it was before, with many Marxists before History and Class Consciousness or the work of Gramsci, etc. And the danger has a name. It's the danger of Stalinism, right? The question is, if a philosophy of praxis, if the practice-centered philosophy, what is it? Where can it lead to that is also problematic? And I find if you compare the trajectories of Gramsci and Giovanni Gentili, you can clearly see what happens when a philosophy of praxis kind of is extrapolated into this notion of action as something that can transform everything without any limit. And this not only means that any ecological discussion becomes very difficult, any idea of limits to growth, of how we deal with the limits to refashioning production, but the question of reproduction tends to be eclipsed when you have a Marxism that is too centered on the ability of praxis to refashion the world completely. These are the consequences when you take it a certain position in attention and extrapolate it. So that's.
Thank you very much. Mariana?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question, Giovanni. I left it to the end, this reflection, and intentionally did not go into it, but you brought it up. So I don't have that developed. So I'm just going to tell you what my hunch is, my impression is, and why did I mention intersectional struggles? Because working with feminism and Marxism, there's always this discussion about main contradiction, the contradiction of labor and capital, and whether feminist struggles are secondary or not, and etc. And there's the discussion about social reproduction. And I feel that many times the discussion goes to a place of halt because there's a binary, or you have either class domination, exploitation is more important than other forms of domination, or you have idea that the other ones are more important, or that you have an equality between them, and all are important in the same way. So a very homogenizing understanding of intersectionality, which I think is very problematic. And it's undialectical. I think it's this bad infinity of just adding perspectives and looking at it from different perspectives and having like a sum of different ways of seeing. And so I think that framing the idea, what I meant in the end was that this idea of a totality that connects reification to the standpoint of emancipation might be a way to try to understand all these relations as connected to one another, not in a mechanistic way as one just being added to the others. Of course, I don't have that developed. That would be like the solution of a lot of discussions, but I think that the idea of totality and how reification plays a role in crystallizing totality into fragments is a very powerful tool that might also be interesting to understand other forms of oppression and domination, and to maybe connect these forms of domination in a dialectical way and not in a binary perspectivist way. Yeah, I think that would I finished there. Thank you for your question, Giovanni.
So just a very short follow-up to that. So maybe you are also suggesting that the point is not to establish a hierarchy between different forms of oppression, or to reduce all of them to labor capital, but to think every form of oppression in its specifically capitalist form. So not so gender oppression or race oppression in general, at least as relevant for the standpoint, but as capitalistic gender oppression and so on. somehow in
if I
the
might
direction.
just real quick, that's a very that's precisely the point. I think there's a this idea by Rita Laura Segato, who's anthropologist, feminist from Argentina and Brazil, and she talks about a low intensity patriarchy before capitalism and colonialism, and a high intense patriarchalism after capitalism, and how it changes in a qualitative way. So she tries to go away to dispel this idea that there was no gender oppression before capitalism, or there were always gender oppression in the same way. No, there was, but it was different, in a different quality even. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great session. It was the third session of our History and Class Consciousness Marathon, 1001 Nights of the Totality. I would like to thank Victor, Giovanni and Mariana. I would like to thank the online audience, those who posted the questions. Of course, Historical Materialism and Paul Reynolds for hosting this event. Subscribe and support Historical Materialism Journal, conference, and all historical materialism initiatives. The next session will start at 8:30, and we will discuss historical materialism's change of function and look at his essay on legality and illegality. See you then.